Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton.
Exciting news! This week, we're delighted to be announcing the launch of a brand new podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. And in this episode, we'll be joined by the new hosts. We'll explore the fascinating story of how the First and Second World Wars are linked. But it's not just the obvious. We'll also look at some of the lesser-known connections and just how the experience of those who saw action in the Second World War was affected and influenced by what they had seen in the First.
Well, hi Spence, and for the first time in fact, hi to two other guests. It's the first time we've managed this on the Not So Quiet on the Western Front podcast, and for a very good reason. Of course, as you've just said, we are announcing a brand new, if you like, a companion to the existing podcast, which can look at the fascinating story of the Second World War. Lots to cover, and in fact, I think quite a few links that we can draw between those two conflicts. As you rightly say, there's some pretty obvious ones, but there's also a couple of more nuanced ones, which may be of interest to our listeners when it comes to kind of telling that story. But the first thing we need to do, of course, Spence, is we need to introduce the brand new hosts to our podcast. It's a delight to be able to do so. They are highly acclaimed and highly skilled in their respective subjects. Both of them have interesting histories as well. I'm sure they will introduce themselves. We've got one man, a Canadian by way of Vienna, and we've got a German by way of the UK. So keeping the international theme running really well here. Let's start off, of course. Let's introduce Jesse Alexander, who's going to be the first of our two brand new hosts. Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Dan, and hi, Spence. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I'm super excited to use a much overused term, but it's true this time, to be one of the co-hosts of the new Second World War podcast. I have to admit, some of your listeners who are into YouTube, they might have seen me before. I host the Great War channel and the Real-Time History channels. And my first love, though, I have to say, when I was young and getting into history, was the Second World War. My grandfather kind of told the stories of him as a veteran. And so that's one of the reasons why I studied history, moved to Austria, studied history there at the graduate level, and have had the great luck to have been invited to co-host a podcast on the Second World War. So I'm stoked and I'm ready to go.
Amazing. And of course, the title of the podcast, Both Sides of the Wire, kind of gives you a little bit of a clue about our second host. And in fact, one of those things that I find really interesting and we're really excited about is there really isn't any comparison available at the moment, which does look in depth at both sides of the Second World War. And Matthias Strone is a great fit to do that one. So hi, Matthias, how you doing?
Hi, Dan. Hi, Spencer. Very well. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me and Jesse on this podcast. Absolute sheer delight and really looking forward to producing the World War II podcast. Because as you say, there are an awful lot of very interesting stories. There are some myths that need debusting. So it's an absolutely great opportunity. And it's interesting because quite similar to Jesse, I also got into the Second World War through family connections. So my grandfather, my grandmother, well, they kept telling me stories about the war, obviously from the other side of the wire, the other side of the hill. And that got me into it. And, well, I've been hooked ever since.
Yeah, it's amazing. And just for those that don't know you already, Matthias, just give us a little bit of a background about what you do as a day-to-day job and kind of how that influences your knowledge and your expertise in the subject.
Well, I sometimes get a little bit confused myself because I basically wear three hats most of the time. So the first one, which is, I'd say is my main job, I'm the head of historical analysis at the Center for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research, which is the think tank for the British Army, where we advise the British Army, in particular the Army headquarters and the Chief of General Staff, on all sorts of things military, and I'm in charge of the historical side, so trying to use history in order to learn important lessons for the British Army of today, including, for example, staff rides, battlefield tours, things like this. In addition to that, I'm also a professor in military studies at the University of Buckingham. And the third hat that I continuously wear is that as a German army officer. So at present, I'm employed in a reserve capacity as a defense attaché, having served in London predominantly, but also Madrid and Paris.
Some pretty impressive credentials all across the board there. So, great to have you on board, and we're really looking forward to this brand new and pretty exciting prospect, to be honest, Spence. Lots of we've covered, of course, the whole breadth of the First World War so far, and continue to do so. One thing we haven't really touched on, though, is the idea of just how closely the First and Second World War are linked, and in particular, one of the things that I know fascinates you is what's learned or perhaps forgotten in the interwar period that is really so important.
Absolutely right. And just as you were speaking, Jesse and Matthias, it struck me that just like you, I grew up with stories from the Second World War from my family members. But those family members we're referring to, who sparked our interest decades later, they would have grown up with stories and with family members with connections to the First World War, which of course had occurred 20 years or so earlier. And I think there's something that it's really easy to forget, that the First and Second World War very much take place within living memory. It's possible, you'd have to be a little bit unlucky on the Allied side, more likely on the German side, that you can fight in both the First World War and the Second World War. And just from my own family history, I had a great-grandfather who was an artilleryman in the First World War, fortunately survived intact. And in the Second World War, he was too old to serve in the regular army, but he volunteered for the Home Guard in June 1940. So there's those connections there. And the fact that the First World War is in living memory of the Second World War, and that so many of the men who will be involved in it will either have that memory, or if they're a more senior figure, you may have actually fought in it and now you're a senior figure again. I think it's incredibly interesting because it speaks to how memory is formed and how different nations come out of the First World War with different ideas. And I think that leads me to a question that I'd like to put to Jesse and Matthias, which is, to what extent do you actually see the First World War as a continuation of the Second World War?
Well, that is a sort of $1 million question in a way. The idea has been batted around. I think de Gaulle mentioned it. Churchill mentions it when in the start of his series of books on the Second World War. I mean, there's some interesting continuities. I have a bit of trouble with saying for certain, yeah, it's one 30 years war. It's one big European civil war. I think there's a certain attraction to the simplicity of that. But as usual in history, as we like to say, things are a little bit more complicated. But there are continuities. And one of the things that I find is interesting is the idea that the German question, so to speak, or in some views, the German problem, is at the core of flare-ups of extreme violence, right? That this new state of Germany that comes in 1871 as a result of this war against France is the bull in the china shop, and the result are these two conflicts. On the other hand, there are some quite important differences between the two, but I don't want to muddy the waters just yet. I don't know how that sounds to German ears.
I think you're absolutely spot on, so I'm not quite sure what I'm supposed to be saying now, but I think you've covered everything pretty much, but I'll have a go anyway. I think you're absolutely right. So the famous phrase of the second 30 years war, which has been used, well, since the end of World War II. Actually, some people even used it during the war, as you said before. That's an interesting one, and to a degree there is some truth in it. But of course, history is never inevitable. We always think that because history played out the way it did, that's the only option that history had. But of course, that is not true at all. There are very, very clear links in some areas. You already talked about Germany, so Germany losing the war, people being very unhappy, making it very easy when you put on top of that the economic crisis for the Nazis to take over. So without World War I, all that wouldn't have happened. Hitler would never come into power if the First World War wouldn't have happened. Let's not forget, well, basically, he was a failed character. He was a tramp in the streets of Vienna and the streets of Munich before the outbreak of the First World War. He would never have made Chancellor of Germany. So there are very clear connecting points, but of course, history is never inevitable.
It's a really good point that you make there. And I think, of course, it's something that no doubt you guys will cover in your own podcast as you go forward. But in terms of the continued connection between the First and Second World War, whilst, of course, I think we can make that separation between the two, I wonder, coming to you, Spence, if it's just as clear that the fighting styles, do they have the same separation? Well, I know we've discussed previously on our own podcast just how close combined arms of 1918 to perhaps Blitzkrieg of 1940 might be. What's your kind of take on whether that's a continuation in the same sense?
To an extent, it's inevitable it is a continuation. we're apt to forget, because they feel like completely separate historical events in our memory, that the First and Second World War are only 20 years apart, or 21 years apart. And there's only so much technological change and military change you can actually have in 21 years. And the First World War, as we've discussed on the podcast, we see these radical changes in how wars fought, what some historians have called a revolution in military affairs, a period of war which completely reshapes the epoch that follows. And I think the First World War actually still shapes much of our current epoch into the 21st century. So it's inevitable it's going to do so with the Second World War. But what has changed is, of course, technology. There has been technological advancement in that 21 years. Aircraft, perhaps the most obvious change. The aircraft of 1939 and 1940 are vastly superior to the aircraft of 1918. But it's interesting if you look at other aspects of the equipment that are available. Infantry rifles, for example, there's very little change between the infantry rifles of the First World War and the Second. And if you look at tanks as well in 1939 and 1940, most armies are still operating a similar approach towards armoured warfare that we can see at the end of 1918, where you have heavy tanks or infantry tanks that are going to be there to breach the defences, and then you've got medium or light tanks that are going to go through and try and exploit. And that's largely what the Allies had tried to do, of course, in 1918. They're just trying to do it with slightly more advanced armoured warfare technology. And in some ways, as well as the technological element, there's also, of course, a conceptual element here, because the men who are going to be commanding the army in 1939, whether it's German or British or French, most of them will have cut their teeth to some degree in the First World War. And I think an interesting question I'd like to throw at you, Matthias, is why does it seem that Germany learns a different set of lessons from the First World War to, say, the British and the French, who have been accused of not learning the correct lessons?
Well, first of all, learning correct lessons is always difficult, isn't it? Because it really depends on what you're learning the lessons for, what type of war you want to fight. And let's not forget that for both the British and the French, the First World War is actually not the normal war that they usually fight or that they want to fight, because their war is much more about colonial fighting, colonial wars. Whereas in the German case, you might say to a degree it's a little bit easier, because the Germans know that if or when war breaks out, it's always going to be a major war against a continental European power. So in a way, it's a bit easier for the Germans, because they only need to concentrate on one sort of warfare. And I think when you look at the history of war, not only this particular episode in time we're looking at right at the moment, it is normally that nation, that army that is defeated, that really sits down, has a very, very deep think and thinks, where did it go wrong and how can we improve? Whereas the victors don't really feel the need to do that. So the wheel of history, the wheel of military history and war, sometimes then turns full circle. And you can see that, for example, very nicely in the analysis of the First World War, when you compare what happens on the British side and the German side. So the Germans immediately after the war, form an awful lot of committees, about 250 officers, and they analyze everything all the way through. And they bring in the experts. So, for example, Leto Vorberg is now in charge of colonial warfare. A chap called Müller, who is also known as Durchbruch Müller, Breakthrough Müller, the head of artillery on the Western Front. He's in charge of learning the lessons of artillery. And so they really, really are very, very thorough in a very Germanic sense, you might say. Whereas when you look at the British side, well, they in 1932 published the so-called Kirk Report. So it's a very small committee headed up by General Kirk. And when you read it, it's about not even a tenth of all the paper that's produced by the German army. And it's also interesting that even though the real emphasis of the fighting in the First World War, even for the British, of course, was on the Western Front, the Kirk Report predominantly deals with warfare in the desert, in the Near and Middle East, because this is the war that the British want to go back to. They don't want to fight another First World War.
That's a really interesting point you raised there, Matthias. And I just want to throw something over to you, Jesse, because, of course, whilst there's learning done by committee, and as I think Matthias rightly says, there's some impressive learning done by committee, there's also that personal experience. And as Spence mentioned at the outset there are a number of guys who find themselves at captain, major, perhaps up to lieutenant colonel level in the First World War and cut their teeth on the Western Front, who are, of course, going to take their own lessons in as much more senior commanders on the Western Front at the opening months, in fact, of the Second World War.
Yeah, I mean, the list is extremely long. I mean, somebody like de Gaulle, if we're talking about learning lessons as well at the personal level, it's quite interesting. You'll have someone like de Gaulle, who's an officer, an infantry officer in the First World War, who's wounded in 1914. And the lesson he takes is that, we need to have armored formations. We need to be able to move quickly. Similar lessons that the Germans will eventually learn and apply more successfully in 1940. But many other Frenchmen learned different lessons. For example, Maginot, who's a minister who oversees the creation of the Maginot Line, infamous Maginot Line in World War II. He also fought in the First World War and was wounded. And of course, he comes out of it, like many others, with a more defensive mindset. Or Pétain, who comes back with a vengeance, let's say, infamously in the Second World War as a collaborationist leader of Vichy France. But he's a hero of the First World War. But he comes out of that war, let's say, with a bit of a defeatist mindset, that the bigger enemy, that it's inevitable that Germany will triumph once they have the upper hand in the 1940 campaign, and that the bigger danger perhaps is the French political left. So there are all these different directions that the traumatic experience of the First World War can take people in. And one of the most interesting, I find, is the case of Bernard Montgomery. Now, there's one incident in particular that I came across that really stuck with me, because Montgomery is a controversial figure, especially in Canada and the United States. He's often criticized. He's often criticized as being too slow and so on and so forth, or being uncaring to some extent towards his men. But as a junior officer, he was in no man's land in 1916, if I remember correctly. He gets hit by a sniper, and he's unable to move. A comrade of his comes and starts dressing his wound, and that man is killed by the sniper, falls on top of Montgomery, and he's stuck. Montgomery's stuck there with the body of this comrade on top of him, who keeps taking hits from this German sniper who's trying to take him out. And he relates this, eventually, of course, he survives, and he relates this then later, and I thought to myself, as soon as I read this, I'm like, okay, so this changes my impression a little bit of Montgomery. There's no way you can go through an experience like that and really, truly, internally be callous towards the fate of the men under your command. So I think there are as many different lessons that can come out of that traumatic experience as there are commanders, and that means it's a sort of endless well to dip into to try to understand the different impact of commanders and also their own psychological experiences as well from the war 20 years before.
It's a great point. And the Monty story, I think we've actually covered on a podcast previously, Spence. It's a really fascinating one, shot through the lung from memory. But of course, he's not the only guy. And we, of course, do need to dip over to the other side of the pond. In fact, it works for us because we're mid-series looking at the experience of the American Expeditionary Force at the moment. And, there are a couple of really famous characters, Spence, who cut their teeth on the Western Front, who are eventually going to become very prominent in the Second World War.
You can almost draw a who's who from this, right? Including, of course, President Truman, who's an artilleryman in the First World War. But two in particular who jump out from the American side are, of course, Patton and MacArthur. And Patton, perhaps the most controversial, perhaps the most famous American commander of the Second World War, not least because of the movie that was made about him. And he's one of America's very first tank commanders. Of course, tanks are completely new to the American Army when it enters the First World War. They use a mixture of British and French tanks. He is the head of the American Expeditionary Force's Light Tank School. He's trained in Renault FT French tanks, which he really likes. And as I said in a previous podcast, he likes them because he says they buck and rear like a horse. Patton's a pre-war cavalryman, and he sees comparisons to this. He goes on to be the commander of US 1st Tank Brigade, which becomes 304th Tank Brigade later, or just before the war ends. And he is literally America's first serious brigadier-level tank commander. And he goes into battle in his own tank as well, which is amazing when you consider how quickly this is happening. He's going from a cavalryman and indeed an Olympic contestant to now commanding a brigade of tanks. And in one of those chance meetings that I think we see in history, which will echo down in September, as the Allies are advancing, September 1918, there's actually a chance meeting between Patton and Douglas MacArthur, who's a brigadier himself at the time with 42nd Division, the Rainbow Division that we've discussed previously. And the fact that these two men who are going to play such a huge role in the Second World War, completely by chance, as brigadiers, happen to meet each other and indeed exchange conversation with each other there. I think it shows, you might look at it and think, well, what a chance meeting, what a coincidence. But in fact, there's a consistency, especially in the American army and to an extent the British army, that if you've done well in the First World War and you're young enough that you're still fit to serve 20 years later, because the American army and the British army are small, you're almost certainly going to end up in some sort of command position when the next war comes, simply because much as the Americans and the British had in the First World War, there's not that many people to pick from, just as the same occurs, of course, in the Second World War. And so, especially in the early part of the Second World War, you see veterans absolutely on all sides of the Allied line. And we mentioned the British and the French, but also the Americans too.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that actually, Spence, briefly, because the account where MacArthur and Patton meet is absolutely fascinating. It's actually been fairly well recorded by a couple of individuals, and I think it's Patton. From memory, I think it's Patton who writes home to a family member and talks about this conversation that he has with MacArthur. And from memory, they were above Spray, which is one of the heavily fought and heavily contested areas of the battlefield. For those guys on our current series, it's actually where that very first large-scale German trench raid comes in on the Americans and does quite a lot of damage. This is a few months down the line, but they're both talking about an artillery barrage, a German counter-battery fire, which is dropping all around them. And both Patton and MacArthur, they say neither of them specifically expresses it, but neither of them want to be where they are. But because they're standing next to each other, nobody wants to be the first to move. So they sit there past the time of day thinking, I hope the other guy's going to leave in a minute. Thankfully, neither of them are hit and they are going to carry on. Although Patton will be wounded a short time later. It's just fascinating how these links come about. I want to throw a really famous one at you, though, Matthias, because I think it's an interesting one. And there's maybe a bit of myth busting here. I'll be interested to hear what you think. Of course, Erwin Rommel, very famous, and is going to see service in multiple locations, including down on the Italian front. How do you feel that his impact in the First World War, his experiences impacted the way he conducted himself during the Second World War? And is the whole Rommel story, what it's made out to be?
Well, as you say, obviously, Rommel having fought in the First World War and having won the Pour le Mérite, the Blue Max in Italy during one of the Isonzo battles, is one of the main characters in this particular context that we've just been discussing. He was very good at self-promoting, it has to be said. So he's very, very good at this. And he's also very good at writing. So he writes a very, very famous book, Infantry Attacks. And in the German case, or in the German context, this probably makes his name more than the achievements during the First World War, because he's not the only junior military commander with a Pour le Mérite. So it's actually an interesting story, because Spencer, you talked about these Americans meeting, and there is a relatively similar event during this particular battle as well in 1917, where Rommel attacks one of the Italian positions. And while he's deciding on what to do, he actually bumps into a chap who's a lieutenant of the reserve. And this one is called Schörner, who later on becomes a field marshal. And many people have said Hitler's most favorite field marshal of the Second World War. So again, some interesting parallels there that you can find. Rommel, of course, then goes on, as we all know, he's got a stellar military career in the interwar period. As always, a relatively slow rise, but that was normal for German officers at the time. He then becomes the commandant of the academy, the War Academy in Vienna Neustadt. And then, of course, he goes on to do all these things that we know in World War II. And when you look at the way that he fought and that he commanded, there are very, very clear links between the First World War, how it acted there as a platoon and company commander, to how he really commanded his troops, in particular, of course, in North Africa, which, by the way, was also heavily criticized by the Germans. So there is an episode from Normandy where Kluge, when he arrives to take over command, and he gets briefed by Rommel, and he says, well, what you're doing is completely wrong. And then he says something, I think it's the famous scene in one of the films as well, and he says, well, it's pretty obvious that you haven't really commanded anything above a division yet. So he's very much the troops commander. He's very much down on the ground. He's not really one for deep theoretical thinking or large-scale operations.
Absolutely, and I'm no doubt you guys will cover Rommel once or twice in the upcoming series. But of course, it's not just individuals that are going to have that same experience when it comes to the story of their own personal histories in the Great War. Sometimes it's much larger bodies than that. And Jesse, just throw it your way for a second. Canada is a great example as a force. Obviously, very formative experiences in the First World War. How does that translate when it comes over to the Second World War and their involvement?
Well, Canada's let's say, a supporting player in both cases, in both wars, right? In terms of being part of the larger British commanded military. But what's interesting about the Canadian story, I think anyway, in terms of continuity between the two world wars, is domestic politics, right? It's this idea that these wars create incredible tensions on the societies that are trying to fight them. Regular people and pre-existing political problems can either be papered over. So you have this famous French unity between the different political factions, or the German one as well, the Burgfrieden at the start of the First World War. Canada struggles with that, mostly because there's a very large French-Canadian, French-speaking minority in Canada that has a different relationship to Britain and a different approach to what is perceived both in 1914 and in 1939 as essentially a war to support or protect the British Empire. So it's 1939 is not seen as, immediately as a moral crusade on behalf of the good. It's Britain is at war. And part of Canada thinks, well, maybe we don't have to sacrifice a lot of our own young men who don't want to protect Britain. So we end up with two separate crises about what to do about conscription, for example. And this tears the country apart. And in the First World War in particular, there are riots and shootings in the streets. So in the Second World War, the Canadian government's far, far more cautious. It actually reminds me in a very distant way of the caution that some of the French politicians feel in France about committing themselves, about what war would mean internally for the country with the divisions that they had between left and right. So yes, Canada's affected. While there are over 1 million Canadians in uniform in World War II, there are quite a lot of fights at home about what should we do with them, and especially should we conscript them, which of course they eventually do towards the end of the two world wars. But there's a lot of politicking that goes into that story. So Canadian domestic politics, not what you would think would be super dramatic, shifting sands, and so on and so forth. But I think it's a representative example of how the war tensions, we talk about battles all the time, but the home fronts, and I know you've covered this on the podcast, the home fronts are under tension as well.
I'd like to sort of pick up on a little bit about, you mentioned about the French, Jesse, because of course, the one thing we haven't really dealt with, touched on a little bit when you talk about Montgomery's traumatic experiences in no man's land, is the idea that the Second World War has traumatized effectively the winning powers, that the French and the British are horrified by what's happened, horrified by the sacrifices that have been made, disturbed as the 1930s go on by the fact that the peace that the war has created seems to be breaking down. And into this, of course, going back to something you raised really early on, Dan, the idea of that the Allies had a method for winning this war, the combined arms of 1918, starts to change a little bit because the requirements are now a little bit different. Because to carry out that type of war that's seen in 1918, you need a massive national effort. You need mass conscription, mass logistics, mass firepower, thousands of aircraft, tanks, and so on, which just isn't available, especially in Britain, but also in France. And this comes back to the idea about how the nations and the militaries we've discussed learn from the war. We've talked about Germany, we've talked about Britain, but Dan, tell us a little bit about what the French draw from this, and particularly about what a certain man named Maginot draws from it.
Well, this is the age-old question, and no doubt once the guys get into the early parts of the Second World War podcast, they'll look at this in big detail. Of course, the real concern by the French really at the end of the First World War is to dissuade, of course, any future assault across at least their national boundaries. And this is where we get we really need to talk World War here rather than something more like the Franco-Prussian War, where you've got two powers fighting each other. Of course, the weak link to that is not necessarily the area of the national border that you can sew up with incredibly elaborate defenses, such as the Maginot Line, enormous political pressure and power put into this, massive manpower and resources thrown into this defensive network in the 1930s, but rather those guys that are not going to be involved in it. And Belgium is a big and notable example of this. The Maginot Line cannot be extended certainly across the Belgian-German border, to a certain extent across the Franco-Belgian border, but it's a long way inland by then, and it's going to be late in the day before it happens. And then we'll just mention the one word for the time being, the Ardennes. I'm saying no more because that's got a repeated moment in history. But in terms of the French story, when it comes to the outbreak of the Second World War, there is, I think, really, we've discussed it previously on episodes. There's a massive rot from the top, and I just wonder whether that concept as a whole is something that underpins and is a hangover from the First World War. Is there just a general disinclination on behalf of the Western Allies to engage in anything that might have even looked like what the conflict of 1914 to 1918 did? Because there must have been extraordinary upheaval, not only in a national level, but in terms of personal levels. I mean, Matthias, German families have suffered appalling losses in the First World War, and that must have had an impact, at the very least, on the manpower level for actually who's available in the late 1930s.
Absolutely. So manpower is down. You're absolutely right. It also left the experience of the First World War also left a scar, of course, on the national psyche. I give you a personal story. So my great-grandfather, he was wounded at Verdun. He was then captured at Verdun, and he was then repatriated via Switzerland in the winter of 1916. And I remember my grandfather telling me then when World War II broke out, well, no one in the family felt very enthusiastic about that because they could see this wounded man with an amputated leg every day at home. So they knew what war was really all about. And you could see that really being played out during the build-up to the war as well. So, of course, you have the national propaganda, which runs all the way through, you might say, from 1918, so the famous stab in the back, all the way to the outbreak of the Second World War itself. So Germany needs to have another go. Germany's been humiliated. Germany needs to win the territories back. All these stories. But when you actually dig a bit deeper and look at what the population thought about that, there was absolutely no war enthusiasm in 1939. So there's the famous episode where war's just broken out, and Goebbels sends a few divisions to the Eastern Front to fight against Poland, so in September 1939. And he sends a division through the center of Berlin because he thinks this is going to be really good for propaganda. So the division marching to the east to win back the lost German territories. And of course, he's expecting lots of flags being waved and people coming out to cheer. And actually what happens is that the streets are absolutely dead because people stay at home, people close their windows because they don't really want to go back to war because they know what war is all about.
Very powerful mental image, actually, that. And for Jesse, for example, for yourself, who, of course, have the family history in Western Europe and, of course, in Canada, but also have the experience of having been resident in Vienna and, of course, being a German speaker, amongst other things. How does that sit with you? Do you see those kind of comparisons?
Yeah, I do. I think this goes back to what I mentioned about Canada in general as well. There's much less naivete, let's say, in 1939 as there is in 1914. Of course, there's a big debate amongst historians about to what extent was there war enthusiasm in 1914 and who exactly was enthusiastic and who wasn't, and so on and so forth. But as far as families go, my great-grandfather was conscripted as a French Canadian. Perhaps, we don't have exact evidence of this, but perhaps not so enthusiastic to volunteer for the British Empire, but gets conscripted in January 1918 with many others and loses an arm in the 100 Days Offensive in August 1918. In July 1940, so perhaps at the darkest hour for the Western Allies of World War II, his two oldest sons, my grandfather and great uncle, sign up. And of course, they join the army, they join the infantry. And when he finds out about that, he has a nervous breakdown. And we still have the little newspaper advertisement from the local village newspaper. If anyone knows where he is, tell the family, because he just disappeared. And it turned out that he got into such a panic thinking that his sons might experience what he experienced, that he just ran off without telling anyone and kind of holed up at his sister's place in Montreal. So that's one tiny window he's such a bit player in the tens of millions, but it's such I get emotional just talking about it, right? It's such an impactful one. And I was reminded as well when we were chatting just before starting the recording of my time as a tour guide at the Vimy Canadian Memorial, First World War Canadian Memorial in France, because I'm old enough. This is one of the few advantages of being somewhat oldish, I guess, or approaching middle age, is that I'm old enough to have met a couple of living veterans of the First World War back when I was a guide, slightly over 20 years ago, let's say. And one of them, a British veteran, Arthur Hailstrup is his name, he was there, and 21-year-old me just wanted to ask him what the trenches were like and what it was like in the mud and on the Somme or in the 100 Days Offensive or wherever he happened to have served that we were discussing at the time. And he wasn't that responsive to that. What he told me about at length was his son, who served in the Second World War and was killed, I believe in March 1945. And how difficult that was for him, and how he thought about him every day, and how he, over 100 years old at the time, wanted me, 21 years old at the time, not to think about him, but to think about his son. And that to me also really brought home this generational trauma and how things were transferred and how that affected the attitude of many, of tens of millions going into the Second World War.
If I can just jump here, Jesse, because what you've said, they're absolutely fascinating and of course, very, very true. So the latest research suggests that trauma, personal trauma, perhaps if you want to call this a national trauma, can stay for up to 3 or 4 generations. And we might have all experienced that ourselves. Just sometimes simple things like the grandparents telling you, well, to finish your plate because you never know when you're going to get food again. So it's simple stuff like this. But again, talking about personal stories, say, I remember when I went to Afghanistan, so I volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and I could see particularly my father being absolutely and terribly upset about this. And I said, well, I don't really understand, because you've always had this interest in history, and we've got all these books at home, and so why do you object to this? And he said, well, it's very, very clear. Well, just look at what happened to our family. So 3 of our family members were killed in the Second World War, and I said, I don't want you to be the next one. So you can see how this really, even today, so 70, 80 years after the Second War, over 100 years after the First World War, still plays a role.
I think it's a really interesting point. And just as you were discussing this, chaps, it struck me again, looking particularly at the sort of 1939 and 40, you've got a sort of interesting, on the Allied side and of course on the German side, this interesting blend where you have officers, particularly more senior officers who are World War I veterans. In many cases, they're distinguished World War I veterans. I'm thinking about Lord Gort, who's commanding the British Expeditionary Force, got the Victoria Cross, DSO and 2 bars, an extremely brave individual who's a real veteran of a command level. And they're commanding an army that's different to the army that they've been in 20 years earlier, because it has this overarching memory about what had happened. And as I said right at the head of this podcast, it's not a distant conceptual memory. It is what they've grown up with. Their fathers have told them this. Their uncles have told them this. And certainly in the British Army, there's a real observation right from the moment the war breaks out that this army is going to need handling differently to the army of 20 years before, that it's a more worldly wise army. The average soldier has this cultural memory about what had happened 20 years earlier, and then they're going to fight hard, but they're not going to have the same outlook, the same naivety that you mentioned, Jesse, perhaps, that you sometimes see in the armies of the First World War. And when you layer on top of that, of course, improved technology, the differing nature of war and things, I think this is where you start to see a very interesting sort of approach to how the armies fight, because they not only do they have to take into account new technologies and the various objectives they have, but they're dealing with a very different type of soldiery than they had dealt with 20 years earlier. And I think perhaps in the case of the British Empire's dominions, Canada in particular, Australia and so on, that pressure must be even greater, because the war it was distant in 1914, and yet hundreds of thousands of men fought, including, of course, your ancestors. And then in 1939, 1940, you've got to go and do it again. What was the attitude towards the Canadian military to coming back and having to do this again in 1940?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of hesitation. The military in Canada is completely ill-prepared in 1939, as it was in 1914. So much for lessons learned, so to speak. But I think the politics of it are really what affects the Canadian response, because there's such a deep-rooted fear of internal instability and violence. And this is one of the reasons why the Canadian Prime Minister, Mackenzie King, in World War II, keeps delaying the idea of fully mobilizing manpower, right? He adopts a policy that he calls, as a very successful politician, conscription if necessary, but not necessarily conscription. So he's kicking the can down the road as far as he can. And then finally they conscript in 1944, or they conscript in 1942, but only for home service and so on and so forth. In terms of fighting overseas, I think the experience at Dieppe is quite a chastening one for the Canadian military. Some of the fire eaters who are anxious to get into action and frustrated that Canadian troops have not seen very much action in the first 2.5 years of the war are reminded of what large-scale combat against a peer enemy is going to be when the mostly Canadian raid at Dieppe goes awfully wrong in 1942.
Yeah, when you think about that, it's going to be a really hard sell to do anything to really push troops towards the enlistment stations when your first major experience in the Second World War is going to be the Dieppe raid. I mean, that's a really tough fight. And I think in a sense, when it comes to the story of the actions that take place in the Second World War and kind of how those memories kind of leak over from one to the other and how they influence people, there's one thing that sticks in my mind, and it may be apocryphal, but I'm going to tell the story anyway because we do that on this podcast, and it does put a conceptual point across at least. But it's takes us right back to Crete in 1942. You can tell I'm not doing the Second World podcast when Bernard Freiberg is going to be a VC recipient, no less, is looking at making some pretty serious engagements against a German landing, particularly a Fallschirmjäger landing, which is up and in around that area. And he's talking, and he's actually going through the process of saying, right, we're gonna launch literally a bayonet charge across open ground, and we're gonna drive the enemy out of the positions and recapture a particular airfield. And when he's going around his room against other staff officers, Freiberg himself has experience of the Western Front in 1917, keeps getting the nod and the okay, the approval from the men around the room. Eventually, he gets to another senior officer with whom he served on the Western Front, who keeps putting his hand up and keeps interrupting. And he says, look, we're going to go. It's going to happen. We're going to do it. And this hand keeps going up. And he turns to this fellow officer and says, I'll give you one word. What do you want to say? And he says, Passchendaele, sir. As a result, and it just absolutely stuns me when I think about this. In that kind of moment, the story goes, you could hear a pin drop. And these minds that have all been there and all experienced those kind of situations cast back to that period. And there and then, Freiberg stops that frontal assault. It's a very powerful concept. And I just wonder, we famously talk in the interwar years about the British in particular forgetting lessons that they've learned. Is it true that all lessons are forgotten? And certainly the story, I don't think to the same sense, Matthias, is ever put forward, or is it that the Germans forget lessons of the First World War as well?
I don't think they really forget the lessons. Well, they learn very different lessons, as we said earlier. So first of all, it's easier for them because they only, in inverted commas, have to fight a major continental war. They don't really have to worry about all these other things that are going on. Then they have a very, very deep think. But when you look at the development of German military thought in the interwar period and also the early stages of the Second World War, it's, and here's the first myth busting really. So this whole idea of blitzkrieg doesn't really exist. When you take blitzkrieg apart, it's actually a very generic development from the tactics and the operational thinking that the Germans had used and developed in the later stages of the First World War. And then put on top of that, as Spencer's already said, modern technology, better planes, faster tanks, and all these things. So they don't really forget these lessons. But of course, they also link back to this, absolutely just like the British. You can see it at the political level. So when war breaks out, Hitler and the Nazi regime, they're very, very unsure about the support of the population because they're really afraid that you might have another revolution like 1918. So basically, up to 1943, they run a policy of bread and butter. And before the bombing really starts in 1943, life in Germany was, if that is the right term, actually quite good. They didn't really feel all the hardships of the war. You can also see changes in the army itself. The army of the Second World War, and that again goes probably against everything that people believe and think and have ever thought of, is actually quite a democratic army by the state, by the standard of 1940. It's very, very different from the class-based army in the First World War, where they wouldn't promote NCOs to officers just because they didn't have the right sort of background. So very, very different in that approach. And that, of course, opens the door for a real adoption of things like mission command. So tactical innovation, tactical change. So that's all very much there. And you also have these links, again, to the First World War, similar to the Passion Day story that you had in the early phase of the Second World War, of course, more positive. So there is an account where a German soldier in 1940, as the Germans are advancing through France, sends a letter back to his father and said, look where I'm standing now. I'm now standing in Verdun. We've just conquered Verdun. It took us a few hours of fighting. You couldn't do it. It was the most awful battle, and we have done it. Now we are going to win the war. So at that stage, perhaps you might say a more positive link to the First World War.
Matthias, I'm glad you mentioned myths in your intervention there, because myth busting is something that Dan and Spence, you guys have had quite a bit of success with on your podcast. It's not only a crowd pleaser, but I think it's historically important to do that sort of thing, to look at the myths or look at the accepted narratives and see, do they hold up to more historical scrutiny? Are historians going in that direction, or are they not? And this is something that I'm very excited to get into on the World War II podcast, because there are no end of myths and legends about the Second World War, many of which are commonly accepted. And it's critical because they're still used for political purposes today. And I think that's one of the important roles why I like being involved in history and public history and on YouTube and on this podcast now as well, is to hold those up to a magnifying glass. And I'm just going to throw out a few of my personal pet peeves about myths of the Second World War, and you guys can tell me if you share my degree of internal angst about them. But the first one that comes to mind is that the victors write history, right? As though the Germans have never written about the experience of the Second World War in a way that's been influential, as though the German generals' memoirs did not have a huge impact on US and British understanding of the war afterwards. And then I'm particularly interested as well in the Soviet and Russian experience about myth making and memory. And of course, today this is more relevant than ever before. But this idea that the Soviet Union won the war on its own, for example, the idea that the French and other Europeans, the British, Poles, Greeks, didn't really bother fighting. There was no significant combat until 1941 in Europe. That's a myth that I've heard, in particular in the Russian-speaking side of things. And then on the other side of the coin, of course, that the Soviets only win because they have more troops than the Germans do, and that sort of thing. So these are just a few. That's the tip of the iceberg. But those are the ones that come to mind for me as major myths of the Second World War that deserve a bit of a critical look.
I think that's such an interesting point, Jesse, because as you say, Dan and I, we've tried to tackle a lot of myths about the First World War, which are very difficult. They're quite intractable. I can say from just reading the podcast email account, we get a few people who take great offense at attempting to bust certain myths. And I actually think it's interesting that the two wars, the myths and the ideas of the two wars, interact with each other as well, and sort of have a certain degree of reinforcing each other. So, for example, the accepted view still to this day, despite all the best efforts of our podcast and various authors, historians, academics, to say, well, actually, the Allies ultimately do win the First World War, and they win it through a proper application of military science and an overwhelming force. and the objectives are achieved, or at least temporarily. And to the men and indeed the women of 1918, it's not a waste. That, of course, is lost. And by the 1930s, certainly in the Western powers, there's a feeling, well, actually, none of this was worth it. It was a huge sacrifice and ultimately achieved nothing. And it's interesting that now when we having just recently passed, of course, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, now so much of modern thinking, 80 years on from 1944, is that the Second World War defines the Western world subsequently, and that so much of what we have in the West now is ultimately pinned down onto this. And the Americans have even referred to the men and women of the Second World War as the greatest generation, a concept that's slightly starting to sort of creep into the British discourse on this as well. And one thing that always strikes me when we have these sort of enduring myths is, and since we're on the myth-busting sort of chart here, is with the Second World War, I think we have an odd myth that is very difficult to shift. And I know, gentlemen, we've all worked on YouTube at various times. We've all seen this. And this is the idea of German military invincibility, which is... there's almost a sub-industry on this. And given that Germany, of course, ultimately is defeated decisively, crushingly in the Second World War, why do you think this particular myth has become so enduring? I can comment certainly on why I think the idea of the First War as futile is becoming enduring, but the German military invincibility, I've got to go to you first on this, Matthias.
I've got no idea what you're talking about. Why do you call that a myth? Well, you're absolutely right, of course. Well, it's I think one of the underlying reasons is, again, it's a myth, this whole idea that Germany was a fully militarized country, both in World War I and in World War II, which it's not. When you look at the sheer facts and figures, just look at how many people get conscripted, the percentage of the population. If you use that as the measurement for militarism, actually France was far more militarized than Germany. So again, there are different ways and different angles that you can look at this. And then, of course, what you have that in both world wars, at least to begin with, they look relatively efficient. They look relatively good. They manage to occupy lots of territory and lots of different land. And they fight for a very, very long time. In the end, they lose both world wars, particularly in World War II, of course, even more than in World War I. That is... caused with an awful lot, or achieved with an awful lot of blood loss on the German side. When you just look at the casualty figures, absolutely staggering. And particularly when you then look at the second half of World War II. Just when you look at how these people die, how needlessly they die, and how bad actually very, very often the military command really is in the command chain. You're absolutely right. It does sometimes beg a belief. Why and how is there this excitement about this perceived invincibility? I think to a degree, you need to turn it on its head again as well. Because, for example, take the British case. So if you say 1914 of that, the Battle of Britain, well, that's the glorious days. Well, everything that comes afterwards can only be worse. So it's you can also lift yourself up by not saying we were the best, but we fought against the best, but in the end we won. I think that's also a very, very important point that quite often gets forgotten. And talking about the general myths, it's really interesting, I find, that when we look at today, and we all think we're very educated and we're all interconnected. And as you said, we've all got YouTube, we've all been doing this. We put stuff out there and people can see it. So it's very easy to inform yourself in an international way and fashion. And yet all these myths are still very much along national lines. When you look at polls and you see who won World War II, I remember being in Russia at Kursk, talking to veterans there, and they said, well, that was all us. We defeated the fascists. The British and the Americans didn't do anything at all. If anything, they got in the way and were working against us. The latest YouGov poll in the UK suggested that 80% of British people believed that Britain was the main power in defeating the Nazis. So it's really quite interesting when you look at this. And of course, what you then find in recent years, I would also say, despite the fact that we, in theory, can just inform ourselves everywhere and we've got all this information flowing, our information is actually far more limited. And let's face it, well, in addition to the great podcast that you do and that we're doing now and YouTube channels, it tends to be, let's be brutally honest, for most people, it's probably Hollywood movies. And just compare, for example, The Longest Day, made in the 1960s, where you had German actors playing the Germans, you had British actors playing the British, American actors playing the Americans, with their individual directors as well. Well, compare that to what comes out of Hollywood these days, which is all about, and Spencer, you already said it, well, the glorious generation, the great generation in America. So very, very different approach.
Yeah, fascinating, and no doubt it sounds like you guys are going to have your work cut out over the over the coming weeks, months, and who knows, maybe even years, as you start to tackle some of these fascinating subjects. But fascinating it's going to be as well. I'm certainly going to be a listener on a regular basis. I'm sure you will as well, Spence. I can tell you from experience, from our side at least, doing with this First World War podcast, and I know loads of guys listening into us right now are going to be really enthusiastic about this. It is a really fascinating experience. It's been a real great learning curve for me personally. I know, Spence, you've picked up things along the way as well. But what a fascinating subject, and so much more to come. I just want to ask you guys now, though, in terms of offering something different or something new to this sphere, a very healthy sphere of military history in podcasts generally, what is it you think can be brought specifically with your own personal experiences, maybe your own national experiences, that's going to really make people want to tune in week after week and find out what you guys have got to say?
Well, from a personal point of view, I hope that I can bring, we talked about the podcast, Both Sides of the Wire, that we want to make sure that we give substantial attention not only to, the British, the Americans, and the Canadians and the Australians, which is very common on an English-speaking podcast or English-speaking YouTube presence or whatever the case might be, but also the German point of view, the Japanese point of view, and so on and so forth. I hope that I can contribute to that. I mean, I grew up speaking English and French, so I can hopefully use that to have a bit more of a familiarity, a bit more of a connection to the French point of view and experience, because there are significant nuances there that I think we often overlook in the English-speaking world. I've lived in Vienna for 15 years and learned German, did my master's degree in German at the University of Vienna. So that gave me a new perspective as well. I've been able to talk to some, in the past, German veterans and Austrian veterans in their native language. So you can do more things that way. I had the good fortune as well to torture myself by studying Russian for the last 10 or 12 years and traveled fairly extensively in former Soviet countries before the current war. So I'm going to try to marshal all of that to bring those different perspectives in the way that I can hopefully connect with them to the podcast. But of course, Matthias is going to bring the real thing, not just reaching for the connection with Germans, but, in the flesh, let's say.
Well, just listening to you again, I'm thinking you don't really need me on this here because, well, Jesse, you can do it all by yourself. You're absolutely right. I mean, this is really the idea, isn't it? This is really the idea, isn't it? That coming back to this whole idea of myth busting, which I think we're going to be doing quite a bit of, just not by necessarily actively myth busting, but by just telling the story and analyzing the events, whether they're political or military, and whether it's operational or tactical, but from different sides, from different angles. And just like you, I hope that my background, being brought up in German, speaking a number of languages, now living in the UK, actually can contribute to that, and that as a team, we'll be able to achieve what we set out to achieve.
So fascinating stuff. Really looking forward to it. Excited to be exploring this new journey and with two of the leading historians on the subject as well. So for you guys that do come in and join us week in and week out at Not So Quiet on the Western Front, you can add a second podcast to your weekly listening. So you will, of course, be able to find, by the time this podcast episode comes out, there will be the very first episode on World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, available in all the usual places, Spotify and wherever you find your podcast. So please be sure to check it out. Do go along, give it a like, and of course, very importantly, give it a review. It's so important in the early stages of podcasts. I'll be along with you as an interested observer. Spence, I'm sure you will too.
I certainly will. And one thing I can say for sure, listeners, is Jesse and Matthias' ability to pronounce French place names is going to be infinitely better than mine, although just about anybody is as well. And also, Jesse, as a resident Canadian, I know you'll probably have something to say about the Ross rifle, which won't draw criticism, unlike myself. So I'm really looking forward to listening to it. And I'm sure it's going to be an absolutely fascinating addition to our podcast lineup.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Oh, I thought you wanted to actually end on that. I thought that was a really nice finish.
I thought I was pointing at you. That's very true. I was pointing at you on my Zoom, but you might be actually in a different direction to what it looks like. I don't know who that's actually pointing at on your screen. Yeah.